very much, everybody, for showing up today, braving the weather and the tornadoes, and coming out to hear a really, hopefully interesting and somewhat strange presentation on a major publication that happened in the fall of 2009, Carl Jung's Red Book. So just a couple of thanks up front. I just want to thank the sabbatical committee, wherever they are, for giving me the chance to do this and take a semester to do some research that'll help me, enhance and add to the Myth and Literature course and the honors course, but also other lit courses as well, World Lit, and there might even be some application for the English Comp courses. So, okay, a couple of disclaimers up front. First of all, this is a work in progress. All right, I started off, had great momentum going. I had to do a little light reading over the semester, and I kind of had health issues in February, which kind of knocked me out for about 8 weeks. So I'm still getting back on track. So I'll make my apologies up front. This is not a complete work yet, but I thought you might be interested in knowing, what the Red Book's about and where the research is right now. So I have finished reading it, and tell you a little bit about what's going on here. So what made this book so interesting is that it's actually a personal record of a breakdown that occurred with Carl Jung. If you know Carl Jung, one of the major founding fathers of psychoanalysis, or in his case, analytical psychology, broke with Freud, and right after that break, and right after some other things that were happening in his life, problems with his marriage, and just about around the time of the onset of World War I, he started to have this incredible flood of visions and images, and thought he was really going insane. As he put it, I thought I was having a psychosis. He had worked with schizophrenic patients for years at the Berg-Holtzley Clinic, and thought that he might be having a schizophrenic episode. So really struggled to get control of these images, and he kind of, if you've ever heard the old expression, when falling, dive, this is what he thought he would do. To take this as an opportunity for developing kind of a treatment for himself, and to see what he could learn about the unconscious in the process. Okay, so it's written from about 1914 to 1930. It started as a series of 5 or 6 black books where he started to write down his dreams and visions. And that was completed, that process was completed by around 1917. And then he transferred the whole thing into this huge leather-bound red folio that he had custom made by a printer, and copied the whole thing in, revised it, rewrote it, added paintings to it, all the way up through 1930. So, question that sometimes comes up with the Red Book: was it ever intended for publication? The answer is a tentative yes. He did, we know from some of the revisions, intend this for a wider readership. He addressed a general audience, my readers, and so there are some clues that he did intend it for publication. He did produce 5 or 6 copies, which he shared with some close friends, but was very hesitant to, go to a widespread publication for some obvious reasons. It's a very intensely personal work. Jung's, inner demons and, shadow side are in there. He was also very concerned about his public reputation. He was concerned that he'd be considered a madman. And he was also a little gun-shy of the idea that he might be branded a mystic or someone trying to found a cult. So he resisted and he hesitated for years and made a lot of false starts. He had some people type it up, they prepared it for publication, and then something would come up, or he'd get cold feet and move away from it. So he did display a copy in his office for his patients. He was pioneering a new technique called active imagination at the time. I'll tell you a little more about that later. But he wanted the Red Book to sort of be a model for this technique that he had used on himself. And he encouraged his patients to make their own Red Books as a way of figuring out, what was going on in their unconscious. So, by the time he died in 1961, it was still unpublished. The way that this thing got to publication is a story in and of itself. It was locked up in a Swiss bank vault for several years by his family. They were also very concerned about his reputation and about, sort of exposing a lot of very private issues. And there were many attempts by scholars, especially American Jungians. They said they would scale the walls, they'd be knocking on the door in the middle of the night and asking for permission to publish this, but they were adamant that it not be released. It was finally released published in fall 2009 by Norton. There's an editor, actually the Jungian expert on this is a man named Sonu Shamdasani. He negotiated with the family for 3 years to finally get them to publish this thing. And the leverage that he got is that somehow passages had leaked out. I think some of them were on the internet, as a matter of fact, not like a WikiLeaks thing. But they were worried. He said, look, you can either let me do it right or let it fall into the hands of some of Jung's detractors, and this could be a real scandal, or it could be a problem for the family. So they decided to give him permission. Norton was really worried about this because Shamdasani and the Jungians who wanted it published wanted it in this format. They wanted it in a large folio version as close to the original as possible. They didn't want to condense it. They didn't want to, have several images on the same page. Norton thought it would be a bust. Who's going to buy this? It was retailing for $200 when it came out. They made only about 5,000 copies for the first printing. 6 printings later, it's now over 50,000 in sales. 50,000 copies and going strong. So it somehow struck a chord, and people have been fascinated with it. There was an article in the New York Times Magazine called The Holy Grail of the Unconscious that came out by a woman named Sarah Corbett, and this really helped to, I think, whip up some interest in the book. It was also displayed at the Library of Congress, at the Rubin Museum in New York, and the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. It was even featured on Law and Order Criminal Intent, with Jeff Goldblum referring to it and talking about it. Anyway, so it's now in the public. Okay, so I want to give you some context. I'm showing some of these images, by the way. Some of them correspond to the text, some of them do not. And scholars are still working on exactly what they mean and how they relate to the content of the Red Book. So to give you some context here, Jung breaks ties with Freud in around 1912, 1913. It's the publication of the book, Symbols of Transformation of the Libido, that really is the last straw. In that book, Jung puts forth his ideas on the libido, which is not strictly sexual in his view. He also promotes some ideas on the unconscious as compensating for consciousness. He looks at the psyche as a system in homeostasis, so a self-regulating system. The unconscious isn't trying to hide things from you or dress them up to hide wish fulfillments. It's trying to reveal something. And whenever the conscious attitude goes too far to one side, or we get inflated with ourselves or with an idea of ourselves, the unconscious sends up images to kind of right the ship. So those ideas, the emphasis on the collective unconscious, on archetypes, these were ideas that Freud couldn't accept. The book was panned. Jung was basically, all his friends left him. He ended up resigning as president of the International Association of Psychoanalysis. He withdrew from his position as a lecturer at the University of Zurich and basically fell into a deep depression. Also, right around this time, he starts to have this infamous affair with Tony Wolff, one of his patients, actually a former patient, now an assistant. And so the culmination of these things leads to this breakdown and this flood of bizarre images that sometimes overtake him right in the middle of the day, on the train. Sometimes, he's dreaming about them. Okay, and a lot of these involve images of an apocalypse. Destruction by flood, by a killing frost that destroys all of Europe. Really trying to manage these images and get a handle on them because he's worried about being swept away and losing his mind, basically. So what he does is clings to his daily routine. He keeps his private practice, keeps the routine with the family, and then just before bed would sit down and try to work on these images and record them and understand them. Okay. See what a gifted painter he was too. This is really shocking. Nobody knew that he had this gift. All right, so what the editors claim, and I think it's true after having read it, the book really is, if you wanted to find one book that had all of Jung's major theories in it, this would be it. The application for some of these ideas and the origins of most of the others are in this book. And what he did was, after writing these down, thought about it, reflected on it, tried to understand it, and then developed it into the academic writings that he published later. Okay, so the book is kind of the nuclear reactor for a lot of these different theories. Most of these, or some of them I'm sure you've heard of before. The two I just want to focus on. One, this idea of active imagination. This was a new technique that he was trying out to get a handle on what was going on with these episodes. So what it involves a technique of entering into a kind of twilight consciousness. Just before you go to sleep, you're starting to dream, or maybe some dream images are starting to creep in, but you're still aware that you're awake, and you're not completely, unconscious at that point. So he would try to induce that state and get images to come up from the unconscious, and then actually try to interact with them in some way. A lot of this has to do with opening dialogues. He would talk to these images and write down what they said. He was embarrassed by this. He thought, oh, if anybody ever sees this, it sounds ridiculous. It's funny because a lot of the figures in the unconscious spoke in this really stilted, bombastic language. It just sounds so corny when they speak. But he said, no, I've got to be faithful to it, recorded what they said, and tried to establish some kind of relationship with these figures. What did they want? What was his connection to them? So that was active imagination. And the Red Book is really a collection of Jung's active imaginations. It reads a lot like a drama with all these characters that have come up and that he's now interacting with. The other one here is Jung's theory of individuation. And this was an idea that Jung coined this term for, and it involves this process of trying to integrate elements of the unconscious throughout your life so that you can lead a fuller, more conscious life. The idea was whatever doesn't come up into consciousness can control us in ways we maybe don't want. So there's a quote from Jung where he says, we're condemned to live out what we cannot bring up into consciousness. So these things act on us without our knowing it, and to bring them up not only frees us to live our own lives, but actually releases a lot of energy too. It takes a lot of energy to keep things down there, repressed and away from consciousness. One of the things I'm interested in is the use of myth and literature in this work. A lot of work's been done already on where the book fits in with Jung's ideas on psychology, but it's a literary work as well. So what you'll see in here are the influences of these books. And what Jung does is take these and use them for his own purposes. So for example, Dante. He takes Dante for the main story arc, the narrative arc of this thing. And he does kind of, fashion this whole thing into a narrative. There's an overarching plot to it. And it involves descending into the underworld, facing your demons, and maybe being reborn in some way. So Dante does this in the Inferno. Redeeming yourself, refinding your lost soul. The difference with Dante, though, is that Dante relies on a traditional Judeo-Christian cosmology. Jung creates his own cosmology in this thing. He uses Blake a lot with the images and with the calligraphic text. He handwrites the text in this Gothic style. It looks like a medieval manuscript, and you can take a look at it a little bit later on. And interweaves images in with the text as well. Nietzsche. He uses a similar tone to Nietzsche. Nietzsche also had that bombastic style in Zarathustra. It sounds like a prophet is preaching to us. So he adopts some of that, although, as he said, that voice also comes from the unconscious, too. The Red Book's also a response to Nietzsche in a lot of ways. In the book Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche made the comment that God is dead, the infamous comment. Jung's response to that was, God may be dead, but we can bring God back to life if we look for him or it in the psyche. So we wanted to look at the idea of God as a psychological experience, as an archetype. And in that way, find meaning. Gilgamesh appears as a character in the Red Book, and he actually has a dialogue with Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is very upset because science is destroying mythology, and he can't bear to deal with these new ideas of science. They're like poison darts that kill him, and Jung's got to find a way to revive him. So all these works he kind of fashions in his own way. Okay, the book opens up with this prophetic voice. There are several passages from the Old and New Testaments, and then this voice comes in that tells us, the narrator says he feels possessed by the spirit of the depths. And he contrasts that with the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times is everyday waking life. And Jung argues that we live on the surface of our lives, that there's so much going on underneath in the unconscious that influences almost every aspect of what we do that we're completely unaware of. And so he feels compelled to go down into the unconscious and record this experience. He calls it his confrontation with the unconscious. At the same time, he's very aware of the fact that he might be accused of trying to start a new cult or a new religion, so he insists this is not to be copied. Don't copy what I'm doing here. Don't mimic it. This is one person's record of a confrontation with the unconscious. Each person needs to find his or her own individuation. So, I'm very conscious throughout that and emphatic about it. He once said later on, I'm really glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian. Because he was so worried about the tenet. And you see it even in some of the trailers. W.W. Norton came out with this whole promotional package, including a movie that looks like something out of, expect Tom Hanks to walk out, or Harrison Ford. And they're looking at the book, they have these white gloves on, they're almost bowing down to it, and it's a little scary actually. They're a little too swept up into the reverence for the book. Okay, so just want to talk to you a little bit about the content here. We talked about the apocalyptic visions, Europe being destroyed by flood, Europe being destroyed by killing cold, and again, he thinks he's going crazy. Then the outbreak of World War I. And Jung thinks, oh boy, this is an instance of synchronicity, and it means that basically I've tapped into an archetype here. There was something in the air here that there was going to be some murder, some event that would cause a catastrophe. It's happening in my own life, and it seems to be happening in the lives of the collective as well, of the society. So he has these two other visions now that deal with the death of a hero. The first one, he induces this active imagination, goes down, he says, I'm in a cave. There's a hole in the ground. I look through the hole and I see a stream going underneath. The bloody head of a hero floats by in the stream, followed by a black scarab. After that, he says, I see the reflection of the sun, the setting sun, in the base of the stream. Black serpents come out and suddenly blot out the sun, and the water turns to blood and the whole thing surges up. Just one of the visions. Pretty disturbing stuff. My God, what does this mean? It's followed by another vision where he sees the Germanic hero Siegfried riding down from the mountains on a chariot made of the bones of the dead. And Jung is at the base of the mountain here, and there's what he calls a young savage with him. And the savage tells him, we've got to kill him. they take guns out and they murder Siegfried. So Jung's saying, I've got to figure this out. Actually had a loaded revolver in his night table drawer. He said, if I don't figure out what's going on here, I'm going to have to end it. So he stays up, works on these images, and he comes to the conclusion that he'd been living the life of the hero up to this point. And again, he's about 38 or so when this happens. We talk about a midlife crisis, right? I've been living the life of the young hero up to this point. I've been successful. I've been ambitious. I've been arrogant. It's not really been my life, though. He was the crown prince of Freud. He was actually called the young Siegfried by Freudians in that circle. By the way, Siegfried's father's name, anybody know from the Norse myth? Sigmund. Mm-hmm. So all this starts to come together. He reasons that this will no longer work for him. He starts to see the limitations of the archetype of the young hero. And what the cost has been is his own humanity. He says, I've lost my soul in the process. I don't know how to relate to people. I don't know how to build relationships properly. I've lost my feeling side. Now, Jung, if you look at personality types, and Jung later developed what would become the Myers-Briggs test, right? He was predominantly an intuitive thinking type. What was less developed in Jung was the feeling and sensation sides. So the feeling and sensation is what's been neglected up to this point, and the relationships show it. So he says, I've been inflated with the archetype of the young hero, and I'm suffering from the loss of soul. And then he starts to think, isn't this what may be happening in a general sense throughout Europe? Inflation with the young hero, the nationalism that results in the murder of a young prince, Archduke Ferdinand, and also results in sending off how many young heroes to their deaths under the war cry of nationalism and pride of country. See the guy holding the spear here? Mm-hmm. These paintings are fascinating because the background actually interacts with the image that you think is in the foreground. And isn't that exactly what's going on with active imagination? You know, the unconscious is coming through and interacting. So the theme here, and it was also the title of one of Jung's later books, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. How do we find meaning in our lives? Especially post-World War I, especially when we go through things like the kind of midlife crisis he's experiencing. How does he find his lost soul? Now, the word soul is thrown around a lot by Jungians, and it has a lot of different meanings. The sense that I think he's using it in the Red Book is with this idea of the archetype of the anima, Latin for soul. Doesn't really tell us much, right? But for Jung, the anima was the archetype of relationship and of feeling. It was, in his view, less developed in men and needed to be brought to consciousness and worked on in the male psyche. It appears in dreams and in myth. A person with an undeveloped anima, this figure would appear as a witch, a sorceress, a seductress. More developed anima, she functions as a guide, as a spiritual mentor of types. And they're all through mythology, you see these figures. Sometimes both. At this, one you can see in the Odyssey, for example. Odysseus has a very immature attitude toward the feminine, as a lot of the Greeks did coming back from the Trojan War. Right? The Trojan War is really fought for who gets the blonde, part of it anyway. That's the rift between Agamemnon and Achilles. Women are property. Get Helen back as well. Odysseus starts off with that attitude early on as a pirate coming back from the war. And then all this sequence of female characters, gods and goddesses that he encounters. And the character Circe in particular is very interesting because she starts as a witch, and then once he learns how to relate to her with a little help from Hermes, she becomes a really important guide. So this idea of maturing the capacity in the attitude toward the feminine is what Jung is looking for here. Okay. Out of this comes some of his theories on stages of life. And he sees this in some of his patients as well. Men spending the first half of their lives building up the heroic ego, And then in the second half, the challenge seems to be when that no longer works, all the things that used to give fulfillment, the ambition and the climbing, doesn't work anymore. And where do we find meaning now? And Jung says, look at what's been neglected along the way. I found this theme in a lot of Greek myths as well. Look at the story of Jason climbing, right? Neglects Medea. The story of Theseus. Remember Ariadne, the one with the spool, gets him through the labyrinth? He dumps her. In the Aeneid, right? Aeneas and Dido sacrifices the relationship, the loss of soul for the heroic journey. And this happens, Jung thinks, on a psychological level as well. Okay, so Jung's anima is a personification of that neglected soul, that neglected capacity for relationship. And in the Red Book, she takes the form of a character named Salome. These are the two main characters in the book, Philemon and Salome. Now Salome, you may know from the Old Testament. Does anybody remember who Salome was? She's the one, it's not a very positive female figure, right?
Well, she was a hero. So.
Yeah. Yeah, right, in a way, yeah. She demands the head of John the Baptist, right? She dances for King Herod, and she demands the head of John the Baptist. Not a very trustworthy figure. For Jung to choose her as a representation of his anima and his soul tells us a lot about how developed that soul is. What's also interesting is she's blind. And she's led around by Philemon, this wise old man figure, who is also her father. And throughout the whole book, there's this tension. She keeps asking Jung to please love her, and he keeps refusing. And I think part of the tragedy of the Red Book is he never really fully comes to terms with her, even through the end of the book. The book ends with Philemon, who's, again, this wise old man in his garden, and he has some guests that he's invited. Jesus, Satan, Jung, and Philemon are all in this garden. No female figure. No Salome. And I thought that was really ironic because Jung, years later, in the 50s, would look at the Catholic Church, even though he originally was a Protestant and then later, had formed his own path. He praised the Catholic Church for this thing called the dogma of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, when they officially recognized the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. So now they're bringing the feminine finally into the Trinity, right? Which is mostly male. He couldn't do it himself. In his garden, there's no room for the feminine. Now the thing about Philemon, that name comes from a myth that's written down by Ovid. I don't know if you know the story of Bacchus and Philemon, this great old couple who live by themselves, very humble, pious people. The gods Jupiter and Mercury enter their village and go from home to home, testing the people to see how hospitable they would be and how welcoming they would be. It's an idea that the Greeks called Xenia, which is very important. It's almost a sacred guest-host relationship. You're supposed to welcome strangers in and provide for them. The people don't do that. Jupiter's upset. They get to Bacchus and Philemon, wonderful old couple, come in, they feed them, they cook for them, all kinds of magical things start happening, so the old couple starts to think, we're not just travelers here, there might be something to this. Finally, Jupiter says, we're gods, you're lucky, we're going to spare you. We're going to flood everybody else out. So they have this huge flood, they save Bacchus and Philemon, and they ask them what else they'd like. They turn their house into a temple. And the one thing Bacchus and Philemon want is that they want to be able to die together at the same time, which the gods grant them. And after they die, they grow up as two trees, an oak tree and a linden tree, that are intertwined. But I think of that every time I see two trees, they're sort of intertwined as Bacchus and Philemon. Anyway, a major part of that myth is the marital intimacy and commitment that this couple has for one another. Very curious that that's not in Jung's Red Book. Bacchus isn't even mentioned. She's absent completely. So I think, again, you see a lot of what Jung's problems were coming out in this work. Some other characters here that I think you might be interested in. There's a guy called a Red Knight who shows up. It's the devil. And Jung is watching this medieval tower. Here comes this red knight coming up, and they have this debate about religion. And the devil says, you know, the problem with religion is it's too damn serious. You people have to learn to really value joy as an expression of life, and you need to learn how to dance. And so Jung, defending religion, says, you know, this is true for me. I really need to learn how to dance. And as soon as he thinks this, he starts to sprout green leaves all over his body. Really kind of a neat thing. There's a maiden in a tower, one of the kind of humorous moments in the book, right out of a fairy tale romance. There's an old librarian who's kind of rude and gruff, and up in the tower lives his daughter. So he takes Jung in, gives him a room. Yeah, you can go up and sleep in the room across from my daughter. So the daughter comes in and says, oh, please, you have to liberate me. Please love me. And he says, oh, come on. This is such a cliche. And she says, you see, that's the problem. That's been my curse. I have to stay here until somebody can see me as something other than a cliche. Somebody take me seriously. And he actually, as they start to talk, pities her, and she's liberated. But again, it says something about Jung's relation to the feminine. She also asks him, you know, can we have an affair? And he says, no, I'm married. Which I thought was kind of interesting. In the dream he says that, or in the vision, but he couldn't say it in real life. Okay. Izdubar is an older name for Babylonian hero Gilgamesh. This is Izdubar. And this is Jung down here. He's a giant who comes striding out of the east, this demigod. And Jung has to explain to him that people in the West don't believe in mythology the way they used to. That things have changed. And there's this thing called science now. And starts to explain to him the sun doesn't actually rise or sink into the ocean and go underground, you know. But actually there's a solar system, and the words hit Izdubar like poison darts, and he starts to die. And Jung, terribly guilty about this, wants to take him to the West and cure him. And then he starts to think, wait a minute, what if I stop taking this guy so literally? What if I imagined him as a fantasy or as a psychic image? And as soon as he thinks that, Izdubar shrinks down to the size of an egg. Jung puts him in his pocket, takes him to a nearby village, takes him out, puts him in an actual egg, and then says, okay, I got to find a way to bring this guy back to life. Says some incantations, and Izdubar is reborn. But he's reborn as a psychological figure, not as a literal truth. This is what Jung meant by kind of psychologizing religion. So it comes through in that figure. Okay, one last little group. The Kabiri, they look a lot like your garden gnomes, right? These are actually Greek figures, gnomes, that come up in Jung's psyche and tell him, you know what? You think too much. Your brain is tied in one giant knot. Here's a sword. Why don't you cut through the knot? And he does it, and he feels all this energy come up. And the Kabiri then say, okay, we're going to help you out even more. We're going to build you a tower. And that tower, Jung years later would build with his own hands for real, as this tower in Babylonia, as a commemoration to them. All right, just to bring it home here. What I wanted to do with this book, having looked through it, is to figure out whether or not it would qualify as a work of literature. It's been discussed a lot as a work of psychology, but would it qualify as a work of literature? So I actually found some of Jung's theories on literature. There's a paper he wrote in 1922, which we think came out of the writing of the Red Book, where he talks about types of literature. One type of literature he calls personalistic. And he says this is when a writer sits down and has a conscious plan, knows exactly what he or she wants to do, right? Has everything mapped out, goes through the writing process. The other type is when a writer is seized by a flood of images and almost compelled against his or her own will to record these images. And he calls this visionary literature. This type of literature is usually very difficult to read. It's challenging. I was watching 2001: Space Odyssey the other night, and that's very much like that toward the end. Visionary work of art. And so what I'm thinking is that the Red Book may qualify by Jung's own definition as a work of visionary literature. Okay, it has some of the same qualities. He mentions some visionary works that he considers to be visionary: the Odyssey, Ovid's Metamorphosis, Dante's Commedia, Blake's visionary works. I guess that would include Marriage of Heaven and Hell and some of the other ones. Goethe's Faust 2. He says Goethe's Faust 1 is like personalistic literature. He had a plan, knew exactly what he was doing, right? Mephistopheles, he wants to win Gretchen and have an experience that would last forever, and then it backfires. Faust 2 is very difficult to deal with, and a flow of images that ends up with Faust finally getting his soul rescued. The character Philemon is in there, by the way. And then Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which is, again, a real challenging work of literature. So the content is archetypal, and what happens is the artist tries to find a language to express it. I'm having these experiences, I don't know, there aren't words for it, there's no precedent really, unless I look to mythology. I may be able to find some images and references in mythology that may help me give expression to this experience. And so that's actually what Jung does in the Red Book. Okay, and this is really one of the most important points that he makes. He argues that visionary literature actually serves as compensation for a society that goes too far off to one side. He points to Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is really, in a lot of ways, a collection of love stories as compensating for the military war machine that Rome had become. And Ovid actually gets banished for this, or for some other works he wrote as well, but Augustus wasn't very happy, but trying to compensate for that. Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, he looks at it in the same way, as representing an absence of feeling. Jung notes that in Joyce's Ulysses. And the absence of feeling, he says, compensates for all of the false feeling, and all of the sentimentality that was leading up to World War I. So that compensatory function of literature is something that I'm curious to look at here. Now, just to kind of round this out, I'm also interested in looking at it as a work of modernist literature, along with works like Eliot's The Wasteland, Joyce's Ulysses. Modernist literature, by definition, has some of these features. Okay, we're looking at post-World War I, destruction on a scale that's been unprecedented, science challenging a lot of the institutions that people relied on for centuries, Einstein's theory of relativity. By this point, for a number of decades, we've had Darwin's Origins of Species. So this search for meaning in life becomes a major theme in modernist literature, and dealing with the chaos of modern life. Modernist writers like Joyce and Eliot and Hesse and others use myth to try to find meaning in daily life. So in Ulysses, if you've read the book, you know, Leopold Bloom going through a day in the life of a Dubliner, and parallel to Odysseus' journey. So Jung is looking to do something similar here. Now, some modernist writers also use that myth to show an absence of structure. I think Joyce is using it a little bit ironically too. Is there any meaning to Bloom's life? You have techniques like stream of consciousness coming into play. Virginia Woolf does this, Joyce does this, but there's an emphasis on how we perceive, almost as important as, if not more important than, what's perceived. So you have writers trying a lot of different strategies in narration and in dialogue. The self is being seen as a contained whole. Consistent whole is now seen as being multiple. There's a great novel by Hesse called Steppenwolf, at the end of which Harry Haller goes through this magic theater, and he sees all these different aspects of his personality. They're all him. And Jung, by the way, had that idea. He said there's a possibility when you dream that everybody in the dream is you. Okay, so look at it that way. What is that telling you about yourself? Okay. Incidentally, my colleague over at Rutgers, former mentor Stephen Walker, has just written a book on the search for soul in modernist literature. And he was nice enough to give me a copy of this book before it's published. I actually reviewed it for him. And so we're combining efforts. I'm trying to apply some of what he's working on to the Red Book. So I'm looking at the search for soul in the Red Book. Okay. So in the Red Book, just like in other modernist works, there's no standard third-person omniscient narrator to tell you the truth about what's happening. There's narrative shifts. The characters also shift one into the other. In the Red Book, there's elements of epic literature, lyric poetry, fairy tales, drama, all coming together and sometimes creating new hybrids, very indicative of modernist works. Fragmented forms, narrative that suddenly stops or goes in a direction that wouldn't seem to be rational. Also a tendency, there's a real self-conscious quality in these works. So the writer's almost telling you about what he's thinking and what he's doing or she's doing as the work, in the work itself. So Jung does that. He comments on what he's doing as he's doing it. It's really kind of a strange thing. He's almost thinking along with the reader, what's going on here? A rejection of the formal theories in favor of spontaneity and creativity. And that's exactly what Jung was interested in active imagination. The experience comes first. We worry about the form afterward. Okay, so bottom line here. I think the work reads like visionary modernist literature. I think it deserves a place in some of the anthologies in some way, although I'm not quite sure how you squeeze that in, but maybe excerpts or passages. Certainly in the Myth and Lit and maybe even in the World Lit courses. If you look at the Norton anthologies, they include Freud's Dora in the Anthology of World Literature. They also include Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So this is more literary in many ways than those more non-literary texts. I think they're more scientific texts and more philosophical texts. In the Myth and Lit class, the book I used, Intro to World Mythology, has a section on how to do a Jungian interpretation of classical myth. So it would fit in there. There's also a section on the use of myth in modern narrative. They mentioned John Updike in some of his works. And again, I think it fits in very nicely there. So I'm trying to stake a claim for literature here on this work, this new territory. I think it's also a great subject for interdisciplinary study. I'd love to have a roundtable discussion with some people from psychology, from art, from history. It would be really wonderful to do that. Okay, the images, again, are something that kind of sticks with you. A lot of people actually, who I talked to, who have bought the book, haven't read it yet. The way in seems to be through the images. And if you check out something called the Philemon Foundation, that's the organization of Jungian scholars who, their mission is to now publish all of Jung's previously unpublished works. This was one of the first. They have 30 volumes pending, one of which has to do with children's dreams. There's a whole bunch of them on the way. They have a great website, and on that they have videos which you can watch of these, what are called Red Book dialogues. They include celebrities. They brought these celebrities in, sat them down with a Jungian analyst in front of a whole audience, and put one of these images up there. And I kind of feel bad for the celebrities because they have no clue what's going on. This is sprung on them. They're really good sports about it. Helen Hunt, Leonard Nimoy, a whole bunch of them. And some scholars too. Cornel West is in there. And so they have this discussion on what do you think this image means? Does it have any meaning for you? Not necessarily what it meant for Jung. So I thought we might try that and just see what we could do with this. Okay, so there's your image. So what do you want to say about that by way of interpretation or parallels to other things you're interested in? Does it remind you of anything? You don't necessarily have to tell me what you think Jung meant by it. But I'm just curious, what do you think's going on there, and what does that evoke for you?
When I first saw that, I was thinking about what you said about Jung seeing himself as sprouting leaves. And the leaves or arms or whatever are now coming out of the dragon, but they're coming out of this kind of volcanic thing. Like Devil's Tower, right?
Yeah, it looks like a tree in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly
or a tower.
what I was saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I think
So there's this elemental dragon, right? This
Yeah.
earth dragon. He's also killing it.
Right. Well, it's actually not that there's any right or wrong answer for this, but your response is very intuitive, and it's in line with, I think, what Jung was intending to do with the image. I don't always think that the author or the artist's intention is paramount, but in this case, you seem to be right in line. The name of the dragon was called Breath of Life, and this little figure who appeared was for Jung, that young savage that helped him murder Siegfried. And for Jung, this dragon had swallowed the sun. And what he's doing is cutting it open to release the sun. This dragon later on transforms into Philemon. So for Jung, and I have to keep saying that, it's not necessarily the last word, but for Jung, this was kind of an example of what he was hoping to do. To go into the underworld, face your demons, and in interacting with them, transform them in some way. It's an archetype that occurs over and over again in a lot of the hero stories. Lord of the Rings, right? Gandalf goes into the mines of Moria, fights that Balrog thing, that demon, symbolically dies, and then all of a sudden becomes this being of light. So working with these things, and remember we mentioned keeping these things down, it takes a lot of energy. So if you can figure out what your demons are and work with them a bit, you can integrate some of that energy and bring it up into consciousness, so it's no longer a drag on you. It's no longer pulling you down. I was thinking of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, right? And since this is an arts and sciences festival, a little tidbit on that one. The Ouroboros, anybody know the story of Franz Kekule?
Benzene.
Benzene, right. Kekule was the one trying to figure out how these carbon atoms could be arranged, what the structure might be. And so he went to sleep and had a dream of the Ouroboros, which is the serpent eating its own tail, in a ring. And he said, oh, it's a ring. Thus was born benzene. And benzene is used in so many things in everyday life. Yeah, the tree imagery is really interesting too. But it's terrifying, and at the same time, it seems to be hopeful. That light coming out. Elements of the sun. Any other reactions to it? You don't have to take Jung's word for it. So I should have waited to say that, because everybody's going to say, oh, well, that's what Jung said. It's got to be Jung interpretation. Yeah, hacking the limbs off. I was looking at this earlier, and I was trying to figure out why are there so many limbs? It's a dragon. Why so? And I'm not sure. I don't know. He didn't comment on that. Dragons in mythology, by the way, typically hoard gold. They hoard things. They hold things in. And if you can get past the dragon, you can release that energy. It's in Beowulf. A lot of the dragons, Chinese dragons, have the sun in their mouths, right? They swallow the sun, so they're holding that. And if you can slay that dragon, you can get a little bit of that sun for yourself.
Down at the bottom, it looks like some of the severed hands are grabbing the dragon. It's like going back on itself.
Yeah, it's doubling back almost. They're trying to put itself back together. Yeah.
They're reaching for the sun too.
Right. Yeah. Clinging. Yeah.
I was just looking at it as the figure trying so desperately to get out of this circle.
Yeah.
As one hand is removed, there are so many more yet to hold him down.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder too, are they going to grow back? That's what I was thinking. Yeah, there's so many more to go. It almost seems, in a way, hopeless. And I think, again, that gives you some insight into what he was struggling with. I mean, really terrifying. Jung also wrote in the book Symbols of Transformation about how a lot of times the hero quest involves breaking from the mother, and the Ouroboros being symbolic of that kind of womb that people are trying to get out of as they grow up. Then the mother appears later on as a more positive figure, but initially, that initial break. And of course, there's counterparts for fathers. Fathers who are always trying to kill the young hero, right? The Darth Vaders. Any other questions or comments on the image or on the Red Book or Jung? I can do my best with it. I'm not a psychologist, but I can try.
Well, I can see blood is so important to him, you know, from the dream that you mentioned earlier, and the blood that's pouring here from the dragon that also forms the basis of the life that is in the tree.
Yeah, it's an image that works in two directions. I mean, it can represent the end of life, and it's also, you know, it's potential for life in there as well. It sustains life. Maybe one of the reasons why it's the Red Book. I mean, Jung wouldn't have just asked for a red folio-bound volume there. There's a footnote, and there's over 1,000 footnotes in this thing, but in the footnote about the color of the book, the editor mentions that Jung was reading some novels that involved Buddhist monks and priests that involved the color red as a symbol of enlightenment. But I think it also works with blood as well, you know, and it appears in so many of the visions.
You know if Jung says anything about Ignatius Loyola?
Probably does. I didn't see anything in here. I read through the whole thing. I didn't see any direct references in here. I'm sure at some point in the collected works.
The spiritual exercises use imagination in a very directed kind of way, but it's directed by a guide rather than by oneself. They're traditional images rather than personal.
Yeah, he mentions Augustine's Confessions. And the idea of you know, trying to work through this on your own. But you know, remember too, Jung was not advising his patients to work through it on their own. He was there to guide them. And I get the feeling too that he wishes he had a guide. I mean, who would Jung go to for analysis? You know, Freud? Probably not, right? So I guess he did the best he could with what he had. He wasn't perfect, and I think he had a ways to go after this. I'm not sure he ever really did integrate that animal, but yeah, there's references to so many wisdom literature too. Medieval manuscripts. It looks like a medieval manuscript, and if you want to come up and take a look at it, you sure can. Look at some of the paintings. He didn't study art, by the way, formally. You know, appreciated it and you know, knew some artist friends as well, but never formally took classes. And he insisted that what he was doing was not art. He heard a voice in his head that said, as he was writing this is art. He said, that's the voice of my anima. I don't trust her. It's not art. What I'm doing is an experiment on myself, and I'm recording the images as they're coming up so that I can understand them and heal myself. It's not a work of art. But I think he was wrong. Okay, if you want to come up and take a look at it.
If I could, I just wanted to say, Matthew, what a beautiful, beautiful talk. And I just think, you know, this is original work. This is exciting original work. I think this has only been available since 2009.
Yeah.
You're bringing us original work and just bringing real glory to the college. But you're bringing yourself to this work. I'm looking forward to things that you're writing and saying about it as we go through. What a beautiful sabbatical project.
Thank you very much.
So much. It's wonderful.
I'm really just glad that the college continues to support this kind of opportunity with the sabbatical committees, and I'm really grateful to my colleagues for trying to understand. I hadn't really read it at that point. I've read through portions, and it was a risk. You know, it could have been terrible. So they were, you know, kind enough and believed in the idea enough. I felt very grateful for that, and I hope we continue to do that.
You're here.
Thanks.
You're here.